Medieval society needed metal. It needed it for many things. Kings needed gold and silver for coins. Coins paid for armies and castles. Lords and knights needed iron and steel for armor and swords. A good suit of armor could save your life. A strong sword could end someone else's. Farmers needed iron for plows and scythes. Without iron tools, feeding a village was much harder. Masons needed iron for their hammers and chisels. They used it to build the great cathedrals that rose across Europe. So metal was not a luxury. It was a foundation of power, war, and daily life. But metal did not just appear. It had to be pulled from the earth. This was the work of miners. Mining was a difficult and essential job. The most sought-after metals were the precious ones. Silver was hugely important. Big silver discoveries could change the fortune of an entire kingdom. Places like Kutna Hora in Bohemia or Goslar in Germany became famous for their silver. This silver flowed into mints and became currency. It funded crusades and built palaces. Gold was even more valuable but much rarer in Europe. Most of the gold came from trade, not from European mines. Iron was the workhorse metal. It was everywhere. It was used for everything from nails and horseshoes to battle axes. Iron ore was more common than silver or gold. Many regions had their own small iron mines. The Forest of Dean in England was a major center for iron production. So were areas in Germany, France, and Spain. The quality of the iron depended on the ore and the skill of the smelters. Lead was another important metal. It was heavy and soft. It was perfect for roofing. The massive roofs of cathedrals and castles were often covered in lead sheets. This kept the rain out and protected the stone structure. Lead was also used for pipes to carry water, though people did not understand it was poisonous. And lead was often found with silver. Miners would dig for lead ore, and then they had a special process to separate the valuable silver from it. The Mendip Hills in England were a huge source of lead for centuries. Tin was a bit more specialized. It was a soft, silvery metal. Its main use was to be mixed with copper to make bronze. Bronze was used for bells, statues, and sometimes armor, but tin was also used to coat iron sheets to make tinplate. This was an early form of rustproofing used for kitchenware and containers. The main source of tin for all of Europe was a small corner of England called Cornwall. Cornish tin was famous. It had been mined since ancient times and was still vital in the medieval period. Salt was another thing pulled from the ground. It was not a metal, but it was mined like one. Salt was incredibly important. It was the only way to preserve meat and fish through the winter. Without salt, food would spoil. Armies on the move needed salted meat to survive. Salt was so valuable, it was sometimes called white gold. Salt mines, like the massive one at Wieliczka in Poland, were huge operations. They were deep underground cities, all carved from salt. Coal was also mined, but it was not as important as it would later become. It was called sea coal in England because it was often found washed up on beaches. People knew it burned, but it was dirty. It produced a lot of smoke and a bad smell. Most people preferred to burn wood or charcoal, so coal mining was a small-scale business, mostly for blacksmiths or lime burners who needed a very hot fire and did not mind the smoke. So, the medieval world was dotted with mining sites. Some were just small pits dug by a few villagers to get some iron ore. Others were massive, complex operations with hundreds of workers, owned by a king or a powerful bishop. These mines were usually found in hilly or mountainous areas. The mountains of Central Europe, the hills of England and Wales, the Pyrenees between France and Spain. These were the places where the rock was close to the surface. Miners followed the veins of ore deep into the earth, creating a hidden world beneath the fields and forests. This world was dark, dangerous, and absolutely necessary for the world above. The life of a medieval miner was short and hard. It was a life spent in darkness, breathing bad air, and facing constant danger. Miners were a special kind of people. They were often separate from the farmers in the surrounding countryside. They lived in their own communities with their own customs and their own rules. Mining was a specialist skill. You could not just take a farmer and send him down a mine. He would not know what to do. He would probably get himself killed. Miners learned their trade from a young age. Boys would start by working on the surface, sorting ore or carrying tools. As they got older, they would go into the mines themselves, learning from their fathers and uncles. It was a family business passed down through generations. Because their skills were so valuable, experienced miners were often in high demand. If a king or a lord wanted to open a new mine, they would try to attract skilled miners from established mining regions. The German miners, in particular, were known for their expertise. They were invited to work in mines all over Europe, from England to Hungary. They brought their knowledge of digging, drainage, and smelting with them. In some places, miners had special rights and freedoms. They were not serfs, tied to the land like most peasants. They were free miners. They had the right to search for minerals on certain lands. If they found a vein of ore, they had the right to work it. They had to give a share of their findings to the lord of the land, but the rest was theirs. This system encouraged prospecting. It gave men a reason to risk their lives in the search for wealth. These mining communities often had their own courts and their own laws, separate from the rest of the country. They were tough, independent people, but their work was brutal. The tools they used were simple and powered by muscle. The main tool was the pick. It was a heavy iron head on a short wooden handle. The miner would swing this for hours, chipping away at the rock face. For harder rock, they used a hammer and a wedge, or a gad. The miner would hold the wedge against the rock, and another miner would hit it with a heavy sledgehammer. It was slow, exhausting work. They used iron shovels to move the broken rock and wooden wheelbarrows to carry it out of the mine. Light was a constant problem. The only light they had came from tallow candles or small oil lamps. These gave off a flickering, smoky light. They did not illuminate much. A miner worked in a small bubble of light surrounded by deep darkness. These open flames were also a huge danger. Some mines had pockets of flammable gas, what they called fire damp. An open flame could cause a massive explosion, killing everyone in the tunnel. The air in the mines was terrible. It was stale and damp. The deeper the mine, the worse the air. There was no real ventilation system. Sometimes miners would dig a second shaft to try to create a draft, but this was not always possible. The air was full of rock dust. Breathing this dust day after day led to lung diseases. Miners often died young from what we would now call silicosis. They coughed constantly and struggled to breathe. And then there was the danger of collapse. The tunnels were held up by wooden props called timbers. But the wood could rot in the damp conditions. The immense weight of the earth above was always pressing down. A creaking timber was a sign of extreme danger. Tunnels could and did collapse, burying miners alive. There was no rescue equipment. If a man was trapped, he was usually left for dead. The work was done in cramped spaces. Miners often had to crawl on their hands and knees or lie on their backs to work a low seam of ore. The tunnels were just big enough for a man to squeeze through. This constant crouching and crawling took a toll on their bodies. They suffered from bad backs and twisted joints. Despite the dangers, these mining communities were tight-knit. They had to rely on each other to survive. Down in the dark, the man working next to you was your lifeline. They shared the risks and they shared the rewards. They drank together in taverns after their shift. They celebrated saints' days, especially St. Barbara, the patron saint of miners. Their lives were hard, but they had a strong sense of identity and pride in their work. They were the ones who brought the wealth out of the ground. They were the masters of the underworld. Getting the ore out of the ground was a process of slow, difficult steps. It began with finding the ore in the first place. This was called prospecting. Medieval prospectors did not have scientific equipment. They relied on observation and experience. They would walk the hills looking for clues. They looked for discolored rocks on the surface. A patch of reddish earth might signal iron ore beneath. A greenish stain could mean copper. They also watched the vegetation. Sometimes certain plants would grow where there were specific minerals in the soil. Other times, the minerals would be toxic, and a patch of bare or stunted ground could be a sign of a metal vein below. A prospector might also follow a stream looking for heavy metal-bearing pebbles in the stream bed. If he found them, he would work his way upstream to find where they came from. It was a skill based on years of looking at the land. Once a promising spot was found, the real work began. The earliest and simplest form of mining was open pit mining. If the ore was close to the surface, miners would just dig a big hole. They would strip away the topsoil and dig out the ore with picks and shovels. These mines were like quarries. They were safer than underground mines because there was no roof to collapse and the air was fresh. But this only worked for ore deposits that were shallow. Sooner or later, the miners would have to follow the vein of ore underground. This meant digging a shaft. A shaft was a vertical tunnel dug straight down into the earth. It was like a well. Miners would be lowered down the shaft in a bucket, or they would climb down rickety wooden ladders. The shafts were narrow and dark. Everything that went into the mine and everything that came out had to pass through this narrow opening. Their workers at the top, using a hand-cranked winch called a windlass, would haul up buckets of ore and waste rock. From the bottom of the shaft, tunnels called galleries or levels were dug outwards. These tunnels followed the vein of ore. They were often no taller than a man and sometimes much smaller. The goal was to remove as much ore as possible while removing as little worthless rock as you could. This created a maze of tunnels deep underground. As mines went deeper, they faced three huge problems: water, air, and hard rock. Water was the greatest enemy. As soon as you dug below the water table, water would start to seep into the mine. At first, it was just a puddle, but soon it would become a flood. A flooded mine could not be worked. The simplest way to deal with water was to carry it out in leather buckets. This was slow and only worked for small amounts of water. A better solution was an adit. An adit was a tunnel dug from the side of a hill into the mine. It was sloped slightly downwards. This way, water from the mine could simply drain out through the adit by gravity. This was a clever solution, but it only worked if the mine was in a hill, and digging the adit itself was a massive undertaking, sometimes taking years. For deeper mines, they had to use machines to lift the water out. These were powered by humans or animals. One was the chain of buckets. This was a long loop of rope with buckets attached. It was turned by a large wheel, which men or horses would push. The buckets would scoop up water at the bottom, carry it to the top, and dump it out. Later, simple pumps were developed, but they were not very effective. Draining the mines was a constant, back-breaking struggle. The second problem was air. Fresh air could get down the main shaft, but it did not travel far into the long, winding tunnels. The air at the rock face, where men were working, would become stale and unbreathable. To solve this, miners sometimes lit a fire at the bottom of one shaft. The hot air would rise, pulling fresh air down another shaft. They also used large bellows, like a blacksmith uses, to pump air down into the mine through wooden pipes. But these methods were limited. Bad air was a constant threat. The third problem was the rock itself. Some rock was so hard that picks and wedges barely made a scratch. To deal with this, medieval miners used a technique called fire setting. It was effective, but incredibly dangerous. First, they would pile a huge amount of wood against the rock face at the end of a tunnel, and then they would set it on fire. The intense heat would make the rock expand and crack. Sometimes they would throw cold water on the hot rock to make it shatter. After the fire burned out, the tunnel would be full of smoke, steam, and loose, unstable rock. The miners had to wait for it to clear. Then they would go back in. The rock would be brittle and broken. They could now break it apart with their picks. Fire setting was a way to break through the hardest rock, but it used up huge amounts of wood. It also filled the mine with smoke and weakened the tunnel roof, making collapses more likely. It was a desperate solution for a difficult problem. Getting the ore out of the mine was only the first half of the process. The rock that came up from the dark tunnels was not pure metal. It was ore, a mix of the valuable metal and worthless rock called gonge. Before you could make a sword or a coin, you had to separate the metal from the rock. This was done on the surface near the mine entrance. It was a job for different kinds of skilled workers. The first step was to break the ore into smaller pieces. Large chunks of ore were brought out of the mine in wheelbarrows or carts. This rock was then crushed. This was often done by hand. Workers, sometimes women and children, would sit with heavy hammers and pound the rocks into gravel. For larger operations, they built mechanical stamps. These were heavy wooden beams with iron heads, lifted by a water wheel and then dropped onto the ore. The constant rhythmic thud of the stamping mills could be heard from a long way off. Once the ore was crushed, it needed to be sorted and washed. The crushed ore was washed with water in long wooden troughs called sluices. The water would carry away the lighter, worthless sand and dirt. The heavier metal-bearing particles would sink to the bottom. This process, called concentration, got rid of a lot of the waste rock, produced a rich, heavy concentrate of the desired mineral. Now it was time for the fire. The process of using heat to extract metal from ore is called smelting. This was a kind of magic to most people. It turned dull rock into shining, useful metal. The men who did this, the smelters, were highly respected craftsmen. They guarded their secrets closely. The most common metal was iron. To get iron from its ore, you needed a furnace, fuel, and a way to get the fire very hot. The furnace was a simple structure called a bloomery. It was a short chimney-like furnace made of clay or stone. It was maybe a few feet high. The fuel was charcoal, not wood or coal. Charcoal burns much hotter and cleaner than wood. Making charcoal was another important job. Woodcutters would cut down trees, and charcoal burners would slowly bake the wood in a mound covered with earth. This slow burn removed water and impurities, leaving almost pure carbon. The smelters would load the bloomery with alternating layers of charcoal and crushed iron ore. Then they would light the charcoal at the bottom. To get the fire hot enough to melt the ore, they needed to force air into it. This was done with bellows. Bellows were usually made of leather and wood. They were pumped by hand or, in bigger operations, powered by a water wheel. Pumping the bellows was hard work. It went on for hours. Inside the furnace, a chemical reaction took place. The hot carbon from the charcoal pulled the oxygen out of the iron ore. This left behind a spongy, glowing mass of iron mixed with melted impurities. This was called a bloom. The smelters would pull this red-hot bloom out of the furnace with tongs. It was not liquid iron. The bloomery furnace did not get hot enough to completely melt the iron. The hot bloom was then taken to a blacksmith. He would pound it with a heavy hammer. This hammering did two things. It squeezed out the remaining impurities called slag, and it welded the particles of iron together into a solid block. This was wrought iron. It was strong and flexible. From this block of wrought iron, a blacksmith could make anything from a nail to a sword. For other metals like lead and tin, the process was similar but easier. These metals have a much lower melting point than iron. A simpler furnace could be used to heat the ore until the metal melted and ran out, leaving the rock behind. The silver was often found mixed in with lead ore. Getting the silver out was a special two-step process. First, the ore was smelted to produce a block of lead that contained a small amount of silver. Then, this lead-silver alloy was put through a process called cupellation. It was heated in a special furnace with a porous hearth, called a cupel. A blast of air was blown over the surface of the molten metal. The lead would oxidize and be absorbed into the hearth or skimmed off as slag. The silver, which does not oxidize, would be left behind as a shining, pure puddle at the bottom. This was how they produced the silver for their coins. It was a clever and effective piece of medieval chemistry. All these processes, from crushing to smelting, required a huge amount of resources. They needed wood for timbers and charcoal. They needed water for washing the ore and powering the wheels. This meant that mining operations could have a big impact on the landscape. Forests were cut down for fuel. Rivers were diverted and dammed. The area around a big mine was not a peaceful green place. It was a busy, noisy, and often polluted industrial site. Mining in the medieval period was not just a technical challenge. It was also a complex business. A hole in the ground full of ore was worthless, unless you had the right to dig it, the people to work it, and a way to sell what you found. The ownership and organization of mines shaped economies and societies. At the highest level, all minerals in the ground usually belonged to the king or the local ruler. Gold and silver were especially important. These were the royal metals. The right to mint coins was a royal privilege, and the king wanted to control the supply of the metal needed for it. If you discovered a silver mine on your land, you could not just start digging. You needed permission from the crown. The king would then take a large share of the profits, usually 1/10 or more. This was a major source of income for many rulers. To encourage the discovery and operation of mines, kings would grant mining charters. These were legal documents that set out the rules for a particular mining region. They would often grant special privileges to the miners. As we saw, this created communities of free miners who were not tied to the land as serfs. They had the right to prospect and establish their own claims. They had their own courts, called stanary courts, in the tin mines of Cornwall, which handled disputes over mining rights. This legal freedom was a powerful incentive. It attracted skilled and ambitious people to the difficult work of mining. A small mine might be run by a single family or a small group of partners. They would do all the work themselves and share the profits. But a large, deep mine was a different story. Digging a deep shaft or a long drainage adit was hugely expensive. It required a lot of labor and took a long time. A small group of miners could not afford this kind of investment. They did not have the capital, so larger mines were often financed by wealthy merchants, nobles, or even monasteries. These investors would put up the money to pay for the equipment and the workers. In return, they would get a share of the mine's output. This led to the creation of early mining companies. Shares in a mine could be bought and sold. A mine was often divided into a set number of shares, maybe 128. A working miner might own 1 or 2 shares. A rich merchant in a nearby city might own 20. This system allowed large amounts of money to be raised for big, risky projects. It was an early form of capitalism, developing in the mountains of Central Europe. The mine itself was a hive of organization. There would be a mine master or manager who oversaw the whole operation. There were different groups of specialized workers. The hewers were the men who worked at the rock face, cutting the ore. The barrowmen transported the ore through the tunnels. There were timbermen who were responsible for setting the wooden supports to prevent collapse. On the surface, there were the workers at the stamping mills and the smelters at the furnaces. Each had their specific job. The output of the mine, whether it was blocks of tin, bars of silver, or blooms of iron, had to be transported and sold. This created more jobs. Mule drivers, carters, and river boatmen moved the metal from the remote mining areas to the towns and cities. In the cities, merchants would buy the metal and sell it on to craftsmen or export it. The silver from German mines might end up in Italy to be used by bankers. The tin from Cornwall was shipped all over Europe. This trade connected the isolated mining communities to the wider medieval world. The impact of mining was immense. A successful mine could transform a poor, remote region into a place of wealth and importance. As mining towns sprang up in the wilderness. They were rough, busy places full of miners, merchants, and craftsmen. Places like Freiburg in Germany or Jihlava in Bohemia grew from nothing into major towns because of the silver in the nearby hills. The wealth from these mines paid for impressive churches, town halls, and fortifications. This wealth also fueled political power. The kings of Bohemia, for example, became some of the most powerful rulers in Europe because of the silver from their mines at Kutna Hora. They could afford to hire large armies of mercenaries. The English crown relied heavily on the taxes from the tin and lead mines. Mining funded wars, diplomacy, and the construction of the state. But this reliance on mining had a downside. A vein of ore could run out. A mine could flood beyond repair. When a mine closed, the town that depended on it would often decline and sometimes disappear. The medieval economy was subject to these booms and busts, driven by the discovery and exhaustion of mineral resources. So, medieval mining was a vital part of the world. It was a story of hard work, ingenuity, and risk. It was about individual miners chipping away in the dark and about kings and merchants making fortunes. It shaped the landscape, created new communities, and provided the raw materials for a developing civilization. The iron in the farmer's plow, the lead on the cathedral roof, and the silver in the merchant's purse all started in the same place, a dark, dangerous hole in the ground.